Thank you so much. Thank you so much for those wonderful songs, and for sharing with us your history and your passion. Thank you so much. I'd like to call upon the stage Cecilia Point, who will be providing us a lecture on the history of occupation and Indigenous struggles against colonization in Canada and the relevance of the ongoing grassroots level Idle No More movement. Cecilia.
Hi, Chika. Not sure if I'll need my glasses. Yes, I will. Okay. I'm a little nervous. Gurpreet asked me to give a lecture, and I'm usually one of those people that just yells at rallies, so I'm going to do my best. Yeah, as I stated, we've lived here for thousands of years. My great-grandfather, James Point, lived to be over 100 years old. So he had a lot of history to tell us, and as you may know, we have always kept an oral history, our stories, our songs, and he was the one that brought to the attention of our community an old village site, which was thousands of years old. There was an archaeology dig there in the early 1900s where they discovered hundreds of bodies and artifacts that were over 4,000 years old. So it was declared a National Historic Site, and I will talk about that again later. My great-grandfather's traditional name was Manat, and which meant great leader or strong man. When the what used to be called the Indian agent from Indian Affairs came to tell us we needed a name, a last name, he said, "My people have lived on this point for thousands of years, so our last name will be Point." So he was the first Point. And my grandmother was from the Squamish Nation, and her father was actually, my great-grandfather on that side was actually from Chile. And the Chilean boats used to come up, and the men made babies with the Squamish women, so there's lots of Chilean people on the Squamish side as well. So his name was Manuel Cortez. And my mother was Irish, and that's me. Colonization, that's a long topic. I'll try to wrap it up in 5 minutes. But before contact, this land, now known as British Columbia, was the most populated place in North America. We lived here in a mild climate with lush vegetation, abundant food sources in the oceans, and the berries and the plants and the rivers and streams. Even in this smaller region of the Lower Mainland, hundreds of villages existed, which can now be traced back through DNA sampling. There was an article about a month ago where a woman was traced back to her 5,500-year-old relative. So our oral history also evidences, you know, our ancestors and occurrences that used to take place, like tsunamis and earthquakes. It's all in our oral history, and it's verified with scientific data as well. So up until about 1778, our ancestors lived blissfully unaware that drastic changes were taking place in Eastern Canada since the 1500s, 1600s. And traders began to appear, and that's traders, T-R-A-D-E-R-S for now, began to appear out from the water off of Vancouver Island, and trading began, and it was, you know, not too bad for us. We were trading our furs and getting new weapons and tools to work with. The Royal Proclamation had taken place in Eastern Canada at 1763 under the British Crown. The proclamation declared that only the Crown could acquire land from First Nations, and only by treaty. So that wasn't always happening in British Columbia. In 1871, British Columbia joined Canada, and that's when a lot of problems started. In 1871, when BC joined Confederation, it was the only province whose Indigenous population outnumbered the settlers. And then rapidly, by 1911, only 8% of the populace was Indigenous. And as you know, there was, not only there were actual slaughters, but there were new diseases like smallpox and influenza, which we were not ready for. So the Canadian Constitution stated that First Nations people were to continue access to their traditional territories so they could hunt and fish and gather. However, settlers were given free access to property. They would just arrive and they were given land. Native peoples started to be placed on reserves. Then the reserves began to get taken away as well. There is a recent story in one of the local independent papers which talks about the demise of the Catsalano Reserve, which was, designated. Native people were to live there, and then the city of Vancouver said, no, that land is too valuable, let's move them. So again, we were moved, put on a barge, and sent over to North Vancouver. So the other thing that happened was colonial governments brought in opposing rules for hunting. A few years ago, I did a project in school on the James Bay Cree and the hydroelectric dam that was going to come in there and wipe out all of their hunting territory. Native people used to go hunting in the winter time because it was easy to catch large game like moose. They would get stuck in the snow and they could catch them quite easily. However, when the colonizers came over, they wanted to hunt in the milder climate, so they made it illegal to hunt in the winter time. And if that wasn't bad enough, if they caught a native person fishing or hunting in the winter, of course they would arrest them, and they would also just destroy the food. No one could have it, so it was ridiculous. The food didn't even get to go back to the village. So there was all kinds of ridiculous laws like that taking place. And of course, years later, there's massive resource development projects happening, like the oil sands and mines, and now the food is actually poison. So another killer began to infiltrate Native people, and that was cancer. Of course, the late 1800s brought residential schools. 1920, the Indian Act stated that Native people must attend residential school. 150,000 people have gone through residential schools, and we've now learned about the atrocities that have happened there. My father went to residential school. Atrocities happened to him. I won't go into detail, but it was horrible. And now we're learning about scientific experiments, drug trials on children. And if children died in residential school, they did not send them back to their families because there was too big of a cost. So they would just bury them in unmarked graves. Terrors from these schools continued to reveal themselves, from unspeakable abuses to medical experiments. Reserves. All of the land set aside for Aboriginal peoples, or reserves, in Canada would fit onto Vancouver Island. So the first offensive was moving us off of our vast lands and onto these strange, unfamiliar places. And over time, people were moved a lot. The Oka crisis was a result of a culmination of these removals. When Jesuit priests arrived there in the land called Montreal, currently called Montreal, they chose a valuable piece of real estate and moved the natives away from there. And then they moved them several times. And then in one instance, they said, oh, there's a nicer piece of land on the prairies, and they asked a whole lot of the Oka inhabitants if they wanted to move to the prairies, and they loaded them all up on wagons and dropped them in the middle of the prairies in Manitoba with nothing. No supplies, no food, so most of them perished there. So stories abound of established communities removed from one place to another in military cargo planes, barges, truck convoys, for no other reason than the establishment either wanted the property for another use or made promises to corporations or resource companies that they could have it. I want to point out this doesn't happen to other groups of Canadians. Further to this, the Indian Act prevented Native people from taking legal action, as was discovered by the group of Nisga'a. By the time colonialism rolled out to British Columbia and the Nisga'a were told, we want to move you onto reserves and take your land, they said, no, we don't like the sound of that. And so a group of them actually got together and traveled to England to meet with the Queen and object to what was happening. But of course they were sent back, and it was illegal for Native people to hire a lawyer. So they continued to fight, and it took them 100 years to get the Nisga'a Treaty. I'll talk briefly about water, education, and taxes. And people think that Native people don't pay taxes. Well, I live in Richmond, and I pay taxes, and I own a home, and I contribute. So even if people live on reserves, they do pay taxes. If you purchase anything that is not on that little small postage stamp size of a reserve, you go to a Richmond Center or Oak Ridge or wherever, buy your gas, you have to pay taxes on it. That's just how it is. So Native people are not exempt from that. There are tiny little areas where they are, but they have to be on a reserve. And likewise with income. We do pay income tax unless you are one of the tiny few that works on a reserve. You do not pay taxes on that income. But if you work off reserve, like most people do, you do pay taxes on your income. So when we talk about, you know, people talk about all the money that goes to Native people, that's our money. We paid that money, we paid taxes. And money also goes to municipalities and provinces and all other projects and corporations. So I'm not really sure why people have such an issue, and it is the way that government paints us. I mean, it is a top-down message, so they're making us look like we're lazy. But of course, they've moved us around, and of course, I've talked about taking, you know, our livelihood away with the fishing and hunting that is now destroyed. So, and it was agreed to, I heard my sister telling someone earlier, it was agreed to in settlement with the proclamation, with the Constitution, that because of the trade for our land, the things that we were giving up, it's mandated that we are to get education, water, municipal services, and with the federal government controlling that, it does not always work out as well. Now for us living close to major centers, we don't suffer as much as those in the northern reserves. I'm sure you saw the situation in Attawapiskat where people did not even have water running into their homes. They had to carry buckets. You know what? This is Canada. Does this happen in Prince George? You know, no, it doesn't. It happens on reserves. Likewise with the education, a lot of reserves don't have schools, and that just doesn't happen in other municipalities. So I just really want people to know that. I talked earlier to Gurpreet this week about police brutality and murdered and missing women. My friend Beverly Jacobs was the former chair of the Native Women's Association of Canada, and she said that the violence against women started with colonialism, because our women used to be decision makers and sit at the table, and it's only the colonial way of thinking where, you know, the women don't have any power and don't have rights and don't inherit and so on. So that's not the way that we used to make our decisions. So Grand Chief Stuart Phillip of BC has stated that not only does police brutality concern him, but the fact that policing establishments in Canada have neglected Native women, neglected their disappearances and their murders going unsolved. I mean, I'm sure you heard, you know, it's not comfortable to talk about, but there was a white woman who went missing about a month ago. And I mean, her face was on the news 24 hours a day, you know, oh, she left her children at home, you know, where is this woman? We can't find her. It's very unusual for her to be disappeared. And the next day, you know, she was at her bank machine. So I don't know where she went, but I mean, they found her. I don't know what happened there. But I mean, geez, when a Native woman goes missing, you sure don't see that sort of coverage. And the police brutality incidents are now investigated by other police agencies. So there was an incident in northern BC in April where a Native man was beaten so badly in police custody that he is now disabled. So there was an investigation, and the New Westminster Police investigated and said, yes, indeed, there should be charges brought against the officers who did this to him. But then the Crown overturned the decision. So these are top-down things that are coming down the pike. The resistance of Indigenous people. So our people have stood up and taken to the streets and conducted roadblocks And people look out, what are they doing? I mean, so now you're kind of getting a little taste of all the things that we're putting up with. And, there was no war. We were not conquered. Every time we threaten that we are going to, start a war, like with the Nishka, the government came back and said, oh, no, don't worry, we'll work this out. Don't worry, we're working on it. We keep going to court, and actually when we go to court, we usually win. But the Crown fights us and appeals what is written in the proclamation and the Constitution. The Oka crisis. The situation again was a piece of property that was borrowed from the band with the agreement that it would be returned. Instead, the city sold the land to a developer, trying to bring money into the city coffers, not the band's coffers, by way of a golf course expansion and a condo development. So the first slap in the face was the pure robbery from the nation, but of course the other important issue was the desecration to the community's gravesite. Caledonia, Ontario, again, the province borrowed the land in question, which was to be returned. And so we're talking about reserve land that was already given to them, not traditional territory. And so again, they sold it to developers without the band's consent or consideration of any kind. Ipperwash. Land was expropriated from the Crown, by the Crown during World War II and was not given back as promised. Musqueam. Outside of the few treaties that now exist in British Columbia, the rest of this province is unceded territory. As I mentioned, there were hundreds of villages in this region. The Crown, through the Indian Act, established reserves, so we all had to leave our traditional lands. A reserve had to be a population of 100 people, or the tribe ceased to exist. The question was the village of Sisnam. Our oral history told of this place. My great-grandfather walked the area and talked about it to us. The village site held artifacts dating back 4,000 years, and hundreds of bodies were contained there. The federal government deemed the area a National Historic Site, but removed most of the artifacts and the bodies and placed them in museums all over the world. The desecration of the bodies was disgusting because there were so many that a lot of them were simply discarded in the garbage. Even having been a designated National Historic Site, the Crown still saw fit to sell or give pieces of this property away to settlers. The area, however, was capped such that no one could dig there. The ugly row of buildings that sat on it did not penetrate the ground but sat flat on the archaeological cap. In late 2011, however, one of the title holders got a development permit and began digging. Once this started, they began discovering body after body. The discovery of this desecration was determined quite by accident. One of our staff members was driving by the site and saw the backhoe. Due to the fact that the Musqueam people took it upon themselves to physically occupy this village site. Our voices not being heard led us to take our protest to the streets of Vancouver, the Premier's office, the City of Vancouver graveyard, and Robson Street. The province still did not hear our pleas, so we finally blockaded the Arthur Lang Bridge during rush hour, preventing people from getting to work or to their flights at the airport. When I saw Trevor Linden sitting in his car on the bridge, screaming his head off, I knew someone's phone was ringing. Sure enough, the Minister of Aboriginal Relations was finally harangued by reporters. So even the media didn't care about us until that moment. My personal protest of giving back and standing in solidarity. So many people came and joined us at that protest. Gurpreet was called to action by a cab driver who was driving by. The Jewish community stood with us. They were horrified at the desecration of grave sites. They invited me to come and speak at one of their synagogues, and it was the first time that I actually heard shrieks when I was talking about bodies being desecrated. But other groups hold political power. Like, politicians don't care. We don't have enough votes to sway the vote one way or the other. If we have an issue, why should they care about us? Aboriginal people are 1 million people in Canada, that's it. People came from the downtown east side, the poorest people came and stood with us. And these were Native people from all across Canada. The teachers' union, the nurses, cops, firemen, everybody could see that this was disgusting. So everybody wrote letters. I posted the email addresses of bureaucrats and politicians on our SASNAM site, website, Facebook page, and they got letters, and so they were heard. So this is sort of where Idle No More is going. With the current federal government whose strategy seems to be to discredit any person or group who would stand in the way or speak out against its resource-based prosperity agenda, our people were left with no choice but to take to the streets and try to scream our message to anyone within the sound of our voices, plundering Mother Earth for a quick buck, a buck for only, let's not forget, a few, again to the detriment of First Nations people, sacred sites, burial sites, health, drinking water, culture, livelihood, was not acceptable to us. And to many Canadians were either just not getting the message or simply didn't care. Well, we were going to show them, so we were idle no more. A group of well-organized women, lawyers, got to work on social media and started the ball rolling on protests and teach-ins for anyone who wished to participate. The current status of Idle No More is the hashtag Sovereignty Summer Initiative. Events are initiated from a main website and individuals in communities across Canada begin organizing. The Idle No More body has now jumped on hot button issues and people are mobilized. There has been some press on how the grassroots are divided from the elected leadership, but I'm still seeing both groups come together around important issues. I'm not aware how the overall leadership issue will play out, but I will say that it is not at all unusual to see the types of divisions such as it is also somewhat of an east-west treaty versus non-treaty groups that are having some hurdles. In a country as vast as Canada, this is not an unusual scenario. I'm also seeing the very young just completely fed up and yelling their own messages to the masses. This gives me a personal moment of reflection, wondering at my age, have I done enough? For them and for my own children. I hear the elected leadership with the same sentiments. So I believe, like many movements and protests, it has taken on a life of its own and will continue to move and to grow and change shape, but I do not see it ending anytime soon. Other groups are inviting us in solidarity with Idle No More, such as Defend Our Coast, which is all British Columbians that are worried about their coast, their tourism businesses, their fishing, their waterfront. Anti-racism rallies, and as mentioned, the police brutality issues, which do not only affect First Nations people, but they affect people in poverty, homelessness issues, and many union groups always stand in solidarity with the predicaments that have faced First Nations people. So what can you do? My message today was to enlighten a group of people who may not have been aware of the issues that have faced Aboriginal people. My own father and many of my family members were ripped from their nurturing parents, their cultural environments, and placed in the prison-like states of residential schools. My father was horribly abused, and when he showed academic promise, he was told by the District of North Vancouver, in quotes, "We don't graduate Indians," end quote. His mother and an advocate from the school had to fight for him to obtain a higher education. How many children in that system did not have someone to fight for them? My grandmother was quite a firecracker. He had many demons in his life and many issues with parenting. He suffered alcohol addiction and bouts of horrendous violence towards those he loved. He seriously struggled to find peace. His residential school settlement arrived after he passed away. We have had to learn to parent our kids on our own, and have done the very best we know how. We are still a nation of broken people fighting our way back from the brink of near complete genocide. Our call goes out to people of all groups in Canada to stand in solidarity with us, to learn about us, to share this knowledge with your friends, your co-workers, community. Ask your schools to include First Nations curriculums, and not just the curriculum that talks about the explorers who discovered Canada and met some First Nations people. We put out the welcome mat, and then we're obliterated. Apologies have no meaning. They cannot be quick wins with no substance or sincerity, as you well know. So we stand in solidarity today with all of you. We would have welcomed that ship. We're the same kind of people. We love our families, we love our culture. And I think it's pretty ironic that those who discovered us thought they had already discovered India. Yet they turn away the Indians. So I do want to leave you with that message that we stand in solidarity with you, and we hope you stand in solidarity with us. I think that's it. Osiem.